This evening, we are joined by Dr. Mark Lutter of the Charter Cities Institute to discuss charter cities and the future of governance. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mark.
Cool, thanks for having me. So I guess, to start, until I sort of pull up the slideshow, I founded the Charter Cities Institute about 2.5 years ago. We're a nonprofit, a 501c3, and so we sort of serve two functions. One, a little bit as a think tank. We have a podcast, a blog, publish papers, host events about charter cities, have a newsletter, and then second, basically as a technical advisor to charter cities. So we're working with projects in Zambia, Nigeria, as well as Central America to basically help them improve their governance system. Like, what does it actually mean to create a governance system from scratch? Cool. So what I want to do here is sort of go through the history of the charter city space, understand what it's drawing from, what models there are to learn from, to understand, as well as to help understand what current issues, discussions are in the charter city space, as well as what to expect from the future moving forward. So basically, I've split this up into, I guess, 9 different parts. Phase 1 is ancient history, so looking at the ancient Greeks, the Italian city-states, and the Hanseatic League. Then getting into some more sort of recent stuff, crazy libertarians who helped in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. They tried to found new countries, largely by moving a bunch of sand onto reefs that and create small islands, but they weren't successful. And I guess I don't really need to fully run through all of these parts because I will do that soon. This is supposed to basically be I don't know, help get a sort of full understanding of the intellectual history of the charter city space, where it derives from, what people are talking about, and what to think about moving forward. So first, what is a charter city? A charter city is a new city with a special jurisdiction that allows a more competitive business environment. They matter because if we look around the world, a lot of countries are poorly governed. Over the last 6 months, I think it's become somewhat clear that the US is also poorly governed. But if you look at, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, it takes on average 36% of per capita income just to legally register a business, which obviously inhibits entrepreneurship, inhibits economic growth, investment, job creation. Combine that with the fact that there is very rapid urbanization. There's about a little under 80 million new urban residents annually. 90% of those are in Africa and Asia. So India has about 400 plus million new urban residents by 2050. Nigeria has about 200 million plus. China has another 200 million plus by 2030. So a lot of people are moving to cities. And the idea of a charter city is, right here are these two big problems. There is poor governance in a lot of the world, particularly in the global south. And there's also this massively urbanizing population. So typically governance reforms are thought of at the national level. So maybe change labor law at the national level or change tax administration at the national level. But that can be very difficult. There's a quote I like from the former Prime Minister of Britain, Gordon Brown: "In establishing rule of law, the first 500 years are the hardest," which I think accurately sort of summarizes how England developed rule of law over a very long extended period. But that if it's possible to basically short circuit that long extended period of developing rule of law, of developing state capacity, things like that, I think that is advantageous. And that's kind of what charter cities try to do. Instead of trying to go through this really long, difficult process to reform institutions at the national level, where they can often be rolled back, where it can take a lot of time to successfully implement those reforms, charter cities basically say, hey, look, there's a lot of people moving to cities, so there's a need for new urban settlements. Let's just carve out a land that nobody lives on, have a new city develop there, and with it, have new rules. So it's a meta level rule for a way of changing rules. Typically, the way of changing rules, if you're in a democracy, you vote, then the parliament votes, and then the president passes it, or something along those lines. If you're in a dictatorship, there are still all of these different stakeholders that need to go in. And the charter city says, okay, stop thinking about this at the whole country level, but start thinking about it as a sort of geographic level, as a subsection, and particularly if you're focusing on areas that don't have a lot of people, that don't have a lot of interest, it's possible to get much deeper reforms than you would be at the national level. So basically, more specifically, what does this mean? It means a high degree of legal and administrative autonomy from the host country. Ideally, what we're pursuing, at least sort of as the model for the Charter Cities Institute, and I don't want to pretend this is the only model, but it's what we're arguing for, is devolve all authority to the city government, except for criminal law, international treaties, and the Constitution. So you don't need constitutional reforms, but all other law, for example, labor law, for example, tax administration, would be decided on the city level. Obviously, this is not going to be possible in all scenarios, because sometimes the Constitution might have relatively stringent prescriptions and you might need a constitutional amendment. Similarly, there's going to be politics in every country, and so if there are strong labor unions, you might not be able to get full devolution of authority in labor law. But what we think is basically sort of set up, this is the wish list, this is the ideal, and then the discussions with particular countries will go depending on the politics, depending on the negotiating power. If you come in with a few $100 million of investment, especially now when a lot of emerging markets are reeling from the collapse in economic activity, as well as the collapse in resource prices, they would probably be more willing to sort of negotiate for a wider spectrum of devolution of authority than in a situation where there wasn't a sort of immediate need for alternative revenue sources. So with that, oh shoot, still in the wrong order. Okay. So to start basically going through, I guess, ancient history, and charter cities aren't really a new concept. There's a long history of city-states, and this list is by no means exhaustive of all of the different types of city-states, but it's sort of some of the at least more prominent ones, the ones that are more interesting to chat about. So the Greek city-states, everybody is reasonably familiar with them. Athens is probably the best known, Sparta maybe the second best, where we basically had all of these entities that, I mean, they weren't very big. At its peak, Athens was like 50,000 people. I think Mike Gibson is on the call, and he probably knows it might have only been 30,000. But basically, they create this vast amount of human flourishing, this vast amount of knowledge that, to a certain extent, continues to define Western civilization. He was a philosophy professor I had in undergrad who basically mentioned you have Plato, and then all of other Western philosophy is effectively a footnote of Plato. But they shared, right, while they each had their own governing systems, and they were basically self-governing, they did share this meta-level culture. So it was possible to go from Athens to Sparta, and you could still kind of speak the language, interact. They shared these common cultural norms and understanding, and occasionally would come together sort of to fight wars, but they had this competitive aspect. Then you have the Italian city-states, which also create this sort of huge amount of human flourishing. And so they emerged in basically the late Middle Ages in northern Italy. And after the 6th century, when Rome fell, there hadn't been that much, I guess, I don't know, organizational capacity in Italy. And what happened was the trade routes were increasing. There was this sort of beginning of flourishing, and that led to wealth in some of these cities, right? It's on the Mediterranean. It's basically a sort of giant lake that allows for a lot of access to other places. And they go through several interesting, I guess, governance phases. So first, they're sort of copying a little bit of the old Roman style, where each city would have 2 consuls who would govern, and then sort of pass on the governing rights every about a year or so. Shoot, I forgot the name of this now. They went to a system where they basically would have an outsider who would come in and govern them. And I think it was called a podesta. And the logic is, right, because these were old established cities, they had a number of wealthy, influential merchant families. And so the question that they were faced is, how do you create a governance system that can keep the peace, can keep the equilibrium between these merchant families? Because if you appoint one of the family members to run the city, and they're going to use their power and their influence to direct resources to their family member, and then you get into sort of a I don't know, low-key civil war. So the solution for this was the podesta office, where they would go and find an outsider. An outsider had to have no commercial ties to the city. They cannot be married to anybody in the city. They cannot have relatives with commercial ties in the city, right? A true outsider. And that outsider would come and govern the city, usually only for a relatively short amount of time. But the logic was that you have this outsider govern the city, and so he's somewhat trustworthy because he's not going to favor one family over the other. He doesn't really know or care, and there's no quid pro quo mechanism to enforce that. The risk, obviously, is he stays too long, but because he's an outsider, he can't build up his own base of support to dominate the city. And that mechanism of governance lasts about 100 years. And Florence, which is typically most associated with the Renaissance, was effectively a Medici dictatorship during its sort of 50-year, artistic peak. The last example I find quite interesting is the Hanseatic League. So it's a confederation of free cities in the Baltic region. And it's an example of a non-territorial contiguous political unit. We typically think of nation states as the only form of political unit that can exist because they've basically been the dominant form for the last few hundred years. And so people have relatively short memories and relatively limited imaginations. But the Hanseatic League demonstrates that it is possible to have basically a confederation of city-states that allows them to, sort of achieve reasonably good things. And it wasn't the only one. There were other sort of smaller, less well-known ones. There's also one not as strong in East Africa that was sort of run by an Arab merchant network. But this started with, the region was governed by the Holy Roman Empire, which, to use sort of Voltaire's quote, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was a relatively weak central authority that claimed to have all of this sort of power, but was very much dependent on the local lords and the local landowners for control. In this case, free city, and there are sort of two terms, free imperial city and free city, basically meant that you were not subject to a local lord or a local bishop, and you were only subject to the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. The fact is the Holy Roman Empire effectively had no authority that wasn't supported by the more local institutions. So being a free city effectively meant you were autonomous, even though you weren't really technically fully autonomous. And what happened was there were sort of two things going on at this time. There was one, a rapid urbanization of basically in the Germanic region, where a lot of these sort of small towns, and they're called cities, but they're like towns, like they wouldn't have more than like 20,000 people. But there was this rapid urbanization happening, and there was also this expanding trade in the region. So one of the earlier cities was called Lübeck. And Lübeck basically had this merchant council that formed what was called Lübeck law. And Lübeck law quickly spread throughout all of the other cities. They all adopted it because it was effective. At its peak, about 100 of these cities had adopted it. Initially, the Hanseatic League was just the merchant guilds in the cities that allied with each other, but eventually it basically became identified with the cities themselves. And this urbanization combined with this basically expansion of the merchant class, and it was specifically the merchant class that would found these new cities and basically have political control of the cities, which differs from the rest of the Europe in the late medieval period, because the rest of Europe was in a large part, except for sort of northern Italy, controlled by the land aristocracy. So these free cities were not, and that allowed them to establish this relatively strong, relatively robust trade network. They fought several wars of aggression, notably against Denmark on, I think, 2 occasions, which they won. Denmark didn't want to trade and open their markets, and so they raised a bunch of ships, went and opened the markets and sort of controlled trade. They had an office in London as well as Antwerp. So this was sort of a major commercial power at the time, though it obviously sort of faced some challenges in that if you're in a country, the way you keep the country together is if one part wants to not be part of the country, you march an army in, and then they are part of the country. But because it's a confederation of city-states, it's a little bit more voluntary. And so there's always this sort of free rider problem where you want to be part of the network to get the benefits from the broader trading network, but you don't want to be part of the network because you don't want to pay the cost for wars that you don't want to fight. And it was in the, mid-19th century when it sort of finally put the nail in the coffin. But it happened sort of practically much earlier in the 17th century when it diminished in terms of practical authority, and the modern nation state sort of won out as the typical mechanism for social organization. So with that, let me fast forward to more recently. You have the crazy libertarians, and I mean they were fairly crazy. So they wanted to create new countries. Werner Stiefel was one of the primary financiers. He was a Holocaust survivor who was a successful cosmetics entrepreneur and saw the U.S. going down a similar path as Germany, and basically wanted out. And so what they did was they tried to, on reefs, basically put a lot of sand up and create small islands where they could found societies. So they did Operation Atlantis. The actual history of this is quite interesting, quite fun. They had, I think, I forget the name of the boat is, but they had this boat that they sent out 3 times, and the first 2 times it like sank before they actually could get to the Caribbean because they were building it in the Hudson. And then they finally get to the Caribbean and start dredging sand, building a small island, and a gunboat from Papa Doc, who was the Haitian dictator at the time, drives them off. And right, you're not going to fight a gunboat, so they leave. And then there's the Republic of Minerva. It's on the Minerva Reefs. Basically a similar story. They dredge a bunch of sand, create a small artificial island, and then are chased out by a Tongan gunboat. They had, I think, like a currency and maybe even like a passport and flag, maybe not passport, but a flag. So they had some of the basic institutions of statehood, at least sort of what might be called the, I don't know, like isomorphic mimicry, the cargo cult of statehood, like the things people associate with the state, but not the actual practical statehood, like land and governing authority, which I think are relatively key. And then basically most things sort of die for a while in terms of discussion. But things come back with 2 things, one of whom is Paul Romer. So Paul Romer sort of coined the term charter cities as we are using it. There are also charter cities, for example, in California and other US states that start with a charter, but we're using the term to mean a new city that has a degree of legal autonomy from the central government. And Paul Romer gives his TED Talk in 2009. He's focusing on a slightly different, I guess, target demographic, where he wants to basically help accelerate economic development in low-income countries. And his model is there's a high-income country that is a guarantor, so Canada, for example, that administers in a low-income country, for example, Bolivia. So you have Canada come in and create a new city, a new administration for that city in Bolivia or in Honduras. He has 2 sort of opportunities to do this in Madagascar, where the president he's talking to ends up having resigning, so nothing happens there, and then also Honduras as well, where he goes down, they pass a constitutional amendment, they get a law in place, but then everything kind of blows up and nothing happens. And he's kept a relatively low profile. He was, for example, chief economist of the World Bank like 2 or 3 years ago, didn't really mention charter cities at all. He's still interested in them, but I think has been a little bit, I guess, maybe frustrated from the lack of progress. And so, right, key to this is that it's a way of institutional catch-up. So he's not looking to create like new institutions that are fundamentally different and weird. He's just looking a way to transfer successful functioning institutions from those environments to environments that currently don't have them, to allow for economic development. Then the other thing that happens around the same time is Seasteading, founded by Patrick Friedman and James Hogan. And so their idea is a little bit different. One, they're focused on the sea instead of on the land. So I just recorded a podcast with Patrick today that will be coming out in 3-4 weeks. Where they're basically thinking about, okay, right, like no country is willing to grant this level of autonomy, so let's go to the open waters where there's a little bit more legal flexibility. Right, it's heavily associated with Silicon Valley, funded by Peter Thiel. This concept of, right, like how do you actually create something new? America is a 250-year-old, runs on 250-year-old code. So how do you, right, like update that code? How do you create this competitive aspect? It wasn't focused on lower income sort of regions and folks, more focused on high income folks who wanted to live somewhere that wasn't as dysfunctional as America. And they were saying this in 2008. So at least I think in terms of that, I guess, sort of skepticism prediction has been borne out. But they wanted, the high income folks, computer engineers, doctors, lawyers, et cetera, to get involved, to get interested. I think what they perhaps underestimated at the beginning was just the engineering challenges of actually creating floating landmass. It's very expensive to create a floating landmass, particularly in areas that have a lot of waves. And so because of that, while they generated a lot of interest and a lot of excitement around the idea, it never really sort of took off on a practical level. The Seasteading Institute signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of French Polynesia in like 2016, 2017, raised a bit of money, but were unable to sort of actually pull off that pilot, that proto project. But basically, while those things were going on, and since the seasteading and since Romer, basically one of the things that has happened is there has been an increased large amount of interest in actual reforms on land. But before going into those specifics a little bit more, there are 4 cities that I typically think of as proto-charter cities. So you have Singapore. It's the only country in the world that didn't want to be a country. So they got independence from Britain in, I believe, 1962, and then they immediately formed a partnership with Malaysia. That partnership lasted 3 years until they got kicked out of Malaysia in 1965. And now, at least according to Westworld, it's the manufacturing capital of the world. Or not manufacturing capital, sorry. It's sort of the future of cities, right? Westworld used it as to show, I think, LA in 30 years or 40 years or something. And it was led by Lee Kuan Yew. It had the sort of benefit of having a brilliant visionary leader. It had a very good location. Their per capita income upon independence was like $3,000 or $4,000 US dollars if you just for purchasing parity power, which is, for example, for reference, that's under Honduras's per capita today. Honduras today has like 5,000 per capita in terms of purchasing parity power. And while Singapore is sometimes held up as a libertarian success story, it is and it isn't. It has a very open business environment. It typically scores very high on any economic freedom index. At the same time, land tends to be very heavily government owned. There's a very, sort of strong, what might be described as industrial policy in Singapore. The Sovereign Wealth Fund owns a substantial portion of a lot of the major businesses in Singapore. So it has this sort of, sort of foresighted, visionary leadership with a relatively active state that allows for open economy, but also state influence in that economy to push it along certain directions. If you want to read a book, Lee Kuan Yew's book from Third World to First is quite good. So then the second sort of interesting example is Shenzhen. It was a fishing village of about 100,000 people in 1980. Now it's the manufacturing capital of the world. Within 5 years, Shenzhen had the tallest building in all of China. So in 1985, the tallest building in all of China at the time was built in Shenzhen. The speed at which it developed was just like astonishing, right? 100,000 people to about 800,000 in 85. When Deng Xiaoping visited, I believe this was his 84 visit. He did, I think, was it 3 visits, 84, 88, and 92. And I think it was actually his 84 visit where he goes down and is interviewing people and basically realizes that these poor peasants are actually making more than a lot of his family members who have like relatively senior government positions. To just give you a sense about the like instant kickoff of economic activity in Shenzhen. And Shenzhen was somewhat unique. It's probably never going to be replicated, basically because 2 reasons. China had forcibly limited urbanization prior to that. Part of, Mao was scared of invasion from the Soviet Union, so part of his strategy was to have a relatively sort of decentralized rural system where every province could operate on its own in case it was successfully invaded by Moscow. So he was intentionally limiting the amount of people in cities. So there was this pent-up demand for urbanization, which Shenzhen basically tapped into. Second, it effectively had Hong Kong right next to it. So Hong Kong had a lot of, they speak the same language, they have the same culture. Hong Kong was a successful manufacturing center and was looking for cheap labor. So Hong Kong was the sort of vehicle within which a lot of foreign investment could be instantly directed into Shenzhen for economic development. Shenzhen's called a special economic zone, but it's sort of closer to what I think I would call a charter city. It was 320 square kilometers. Most special economic zones today are much smaller. It was a city, not just a industrial park or a sort of small area, right? It had residential, it had commercial, it had industrial, it has a stock market, it had everything. they pioneered a bunch of reforms that later spread throughout the rest of China, including labor reforms, including state-owned enterprise reforms, foreign direct investment, and now it's the population is 20 million. I mean, it's like literally comparable to New York, which, given that 40 years ago was like a bunch of mud flats and fishing villages, is quite an impressive transformation. Hong Kong, well, like today, it's not really doing so great, but it's sort of one of the classic examples, colonized by Britain during the First Opium War in, I forget, like 1841, 42. And after the Second World War, it had been devastated by Japanese occupation. The population had dropped from like 1.3 or 1.4 million to like 600,000 during the occupation. Then from 45 at 600,000 to 51, it grew from 600,000 to 1.8 million, 2.1 million, I think. So like the population almost like more than tripled in just 6 years. And part of it was people returning to their houses after fleeing the Japanese occupation. And then part of it was also people fleeing the Chinese Civil War, particularly a sort of industrial class from Shanghai that brought knowledge of textile manufacturing that sort of helped kick off the Hong Kong miracle. And one of the sort of famous guy who ran it, John Cowperthwaite, he was the governor who basically, his philosophy was positive non-interventionism. He was kind of like, leave them alone, but when you have money, sort of build out infrastructure to help them. And then, became a manufacturing center. When I was a kid, or when I remember looking at toys, it would be like made in Hong Kong. And then in the early 90s, it sort of transformed again into the financial center, offshoring a lot of the manufacturing to mainland China, but basically becoming the financial vehicle to get a lot of investment and to invest that in mainland China. Actually, one of my big regrets is that now I'm never going to get to see Hong Kong because it's dead. So I mean, even all right, the buildings will still be there, but it doesn't exist anymore, which is, I don't know, sad. And then there is Dubai. So Dubai, there was 30% literacy in 71. Like life expectancy was like 51 to 52 years. Right, this is sort of the poorest of the poor countries today. And now it's I don't know, a sort of global city. Everybody knows Dubai. And they basically were able to parlay this sort of general dysfunction in the Middle East, combined with a huge boatload of oil money pouring in, to become very successful. Dubai itself only had a limited amount of oil money. Like Abu Dhabi, its neighbor, has a boatload of oil money. Dubai has a very limited amount. But what they did was sort of these strategic major infrastructure investments, like building big ports, taking advantage of Iranian mistakes. On several occasions, Iran would put a bunch of taxes on their ports, and Dubai would basically be like, hey, like Iranians, come here and you can, we'll be a free port. You don't have to pay taxes. We'll even potentially give you some land. And so this combination of these sort of big infrastructure projects, plus taking advantage of regional missteps when the Iranian Revolution happened. Previously, planes would land at Tehran going east-west or west-east. And after the Iranian Revolution, Dubai was like, hey, you can stop in Dubai going east-west or west-east. Similarly, the financial center of the Middle East used to be Lebanon, and then or Beirut. Then Lebanon had a civil war. So, all right, you need to do finance in the Middle East, go to Dubai. And then they also basically have a relatively cosmopolitan tolerance. So while a lot of places in the Middle East have relatively sort of stringent cultural and religious norms and requirements, Dubai is quite liberal. So it's quite interesting. If you go there and talk to folks, everybody is very insistent. Like, we are not Saudi Arabia. Women can walk around with like their faces showing and all of these things, because I think there's a perception that, like at least from people who haven't really traveled that much, that the Middle East is somewhat homogenous. And Dubai, I think, is very proud of their sort of, I don't know, multiculturalism. I think 90% of people living in Dubai are not Emiratis. The actual Emirati population is quite small. And so all of these basically show, like, look, it is possible to grow from effectively nothing to being a world-class city relatively quickly. All right, so that brings us to today. So, right, like, what are we actually looking at today? What's happened since Paul Romer and Patrick Friedman, the Seasteading Institute, is this has gone from sort of like an idea to actual execution. It's still in the very early stages, but the execution is starting. So what are some projects? Nkwashi, it's a new city in Zambia, being built outside Lusaka for 100,000 residents. It's about 3,100 acres, which is about 12 square kilometers. It's about 40 minutes outside the central business district. We being the Charter Cities Institute, negotiated with the Zambian Development Agency for a memorandum of understanding to help them improve their special economic zone laws. We signed that in February, but COVID has disrupted that, and Zambia is in the middle of a major debt crisis. So even if COVID wasn't here, we're not sure we could make a lot of progress on that right now. But Nkwashi is still a very good project. NeWAY Capital is the CEO. He's super cool. They're launching a university. They want to create a knowledge economy. Zambia is a copper economy, so they're very dependent on copper prices. And Zambia is also landlocked. So how do you sort of insulate yourself from the local economy? By exporting. So your revenues are in US dollars or euros, not the Zambian kwacha. And because they're landlocked, it's quite cost effective or costly to export goods. So you export services instead. And so the university will start to create a small tech hub once it's up and running. Second project in Yimba Economic City. It's a new city in Abia State, Nigeria, being built for 1.5 million residents on 25,000 acres, which is about a little under 100 square kilometers. They've acquired the land. Nigeria has a relatively sort of comprehensive special economic zone legislation. And so we helped draft the regulations, and they were going to be submitted to the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority, but that has been put on hiatus given COVID. And they were also planning to raise a bit of money for phase 1 this year. But also, right, a little bit of pause because of COVID. So COVID is not great, guys. Talent City, it's a new town being built in Cross River State for tech workers on an old special economic zone. Ayino Lua Aboyeji is the lead. He co-founded Andela and Flutterwave. It already has special economic zone status, and he's looking to lease the old special economic zone from the government and attract tech workers from Lagos, because Lagos has a huge amount of tech talent. They've sent 13 companies through Y Combinator, but Lagos is also a not very functional city. When I visited, we met with the former governor of Cross River State, Donald Duke, and he lived on one of the wealthiest streets in Lagos, and there were potholes in front of the street, on the street, that were about a foot deep. So the question is, right, why are there potholes a foot deep on the wealthiest street? And presumably because it's wealthy and they could get those potholes fixed if they really wanted. My working hypothesis is that they are to make it more difficult for kidnappers to drive away quickly, to give you a sense of the, general challenge in Nigeria. So if you can build a successful tech hub, that's nice. It's an hour flight from Lagos with a higher standard of living, not as polluted, not as noisy. You can attract a bit of tech talent. And then you also have Prospera. This was announced a few weeks ago. It's a new town being developed in Roatan, Honduras. And Honduras, because of sort of Paul Romer's legacy, has the most advanced charter city legislation called the ZEDA, Zona de Empleo y Desarrollo Económico, in the world. So Rotan's an island of about 60,000 people, and they're sort of focusing a little bit more on the resort aspect first before scaling up. And it's advantageous because it makes it more difficult for the government to change their mind and sort of march an army of farmers on, which is the typical Latin America strategy for disrupting infrastructure projects that have opposition, to hire a bunch of farmers and get them to protest whatever that infrastructure project is. And because it's on Roatan, it's difficult. The trade-off is that because it's on Roatan, it's a little bit more difficult to scale, because Roatan is a tropical island with only 60,000 residents. But it has is further along in terms of the governance aspect, because they already have permission and they already have the sort of legal system, at least the basics of it, set up. There's a handful of other projects in relatively earlier stages. This is just sort of some that we're working with or are more familiar with that I wanted to highlight. But we're very much in the phase 1 of charter city projects. So what are, I guess, some of the competing visions in the charter city space? So one of them is competitive governance versus path dependence. Like, what is the primary value of charter cities? So competitive governance basically says, look, there are all these different governing units, and once they compete with each other, there's pressure on them. They will become better. There will be these new unexpected outcomes, and humanity benefits. Path dependence is the argument is like, hey, all right, there is a constitutional moment, and if you get that constitutional moment right, where you get all the stakeholders to sit down and figure out what the deal is, get that constitutional moment right, and then you sort of set up a good feedback loop where the developer is helping to govern the city, but also benefits from the increase in land prices, and that is a sufficient mechanism for success. These aren't two things that are mutually exclusive. You can believe both of them, but I think there is some differences in the community about the degree of emphasis you put on competitive governance versus path dependence. From my personal perspective, I think path dependence is more important for the first probably 20 to 30 years. Competitive governance might kick in later, but if you look at the US, for example, the US didn't have much competition. The US was very much a sort of path dependence. They got the constitutional moment right, and it wasn't really the US Constitution, because a lot of other countries that were colonized by the British and had native populations that were wiped out through a combination of genocide and disease performed similarly. So it wasn't the Constitution per se, but it was this unique culture and unique mix of people that led to that outcome. If you look at where competitive governance kicks in, that I think you can look at actually, ancient Greece, as well as Renaissance Italy, and then also the late Middle Ages in Europe generally. That's, I think, the Montesquieu argument, where because you have a lot of sort of competing political units, it puts pressure, and that's one of the reasons commonly given for why Europe was able to achieve the Industrial Revolution and not China. But that tends to work over very long time horizons, so I don't think it's going to be an immediate dynamic in the short-term future. A second part of competing visions is, what does the regulatory system actually look like? So one perspective is state capacity. If you want effectively a strong government, and this would be the city government that would be able to set the regulations and enforce the regulations and make decisions in a way that was intelligent and cost effective. The other idea is to develop market mechanisms, where then the city government won't be doing that much, but you have these insurance mechanisms that can kick in that will sort of serve to restrain behavior. So if people have insurance against sort of polluting, then the insurance will be priced according to their amount they pollute, and that serves to create the city governance. I tend to favor state capacity. I think market mechanisms are quite interesting and might work, but given the inherent uncertainty in the charter city space at this stage, my preference is to de-risk on every level. And we know that state capacity is a thing and matters. And the market mechanisms, there's a reasonably high degree of uncertainty in just how they work because they haven't been tested. So first generation, I tend to say, all right, let's focus on state capacity, and we can worry about the market mechanisms a bit later. The third sort of, point of discussion is governance and real estate. So how much should you basically bundle them together? You can create the governance stack and then basically work with different partners to develop the real estate stack, or you could fully bundle them together and build them all out at front. And this is less a, ideological question, more of a practical question. How do you put this together? And I tend to think that the first generation will be bundled together just because nobody really has figured out the governance stack yet. And so because of that, anybody who is doing the real estate will need to figure out the governance stack. And the process of figuring out the governance stack, if you're doing that is then necessary. I think the caveat is, if we look at how hotels and hotel chains sort of grew, they eventually uncoupled hotel management and ownership. So the Hilton brand doesn't really own hotels. It's just these private operators that own the hotels and then have the Hilton brand to attract tenants. The sort of third thing is tech versus manufacturing, right? Who do you get as the anchor tenant? Do you focus on high-skilled, high human capital, high productivity people, or do you focus on low-skilled, low human capital, low productivity people, but a lot more of them? And so both of these work. You can think of it sort of like Shenzhen versus Dubai. Both of them are successful cities. Dubai effectively imported a lot of human capital, mostly from Europe. And that's how it sort of instantly could level up. Shenzhen went up the value chain in the traditional manner by starting out with low-skill manufacturing, and slowly, as the skills grew, as the supply chain grew, growing from there to the extent that now they don't really have low-skill manufacturing anymore. The prices are too high. I tend to have a slight preference for the manufacturing just because I think it's easier to scale. My interest is sort of big impact, and the 80 million new urban residents annually, the vast majority of them are going to be low skilled, are going to have low human capital. And so if you're thinking about how to address the widest possible market, I think the manufacturing is key there. But tech projects are definitely possible and definitely could succeed. I just don't think they scale as well as the manufacturing. Okay, so now open questions. So one is the international development community, right? They have a lot of money and a decent bit of influence. So think like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the UN, and a lot of other organizations and professors. And one of the things that we have been doing at the Charter Cities Institute is to try to engage the international development community. But because they have all these resources, right, a lot of these projects will probably need to raise from development banks first, because in terms of raising a lot of money, a few $100 million in emerging markets, the capital markets aren't that big. So the development banks have mandates to invest in emerging markets, and the development banks are probably who are going to write some of those checks until there can be proof of concept and sort of bring in the private investors who otherwise might be a little bit skittish. But like how deeply they engage and like what they do, there's also a risk because they tend to be not very entrepreneurial and tend to have somewhat static mental models that you don't want to, right? You want them to sort of follow and to support, but if they lead, there is the risk that they end up sort of taking it down a path that wouldn't be successful. Second challenge, you have geopolitics, particularly with COVID. You have sort of the withdrawal of the American hegemon, and Belt and Road is trying to increase its influence largely through these large infrastructure projects. And so we're living in interesting times where the typical assumptions that have dominated over the last 20, 30 years no longer exist. So what does this actually mean for charter cities? There's probably going to be a rise of regional powers. There's been a talk of a new scramble for Africa over the last few years, which exists because the U.S. is withdrawing the security umbrella. And so there's a question of all of these other spheres of influence trying to be carved out for access to resources. And so, right, like charter cities are they're business projects, they need to be financially successful. They're also political projects, and that includes this sort of broader geopolitical element. A third question is post-COVID demand. So a lot of resource-dependent low-income countries, Nigeria, right, they're very dependent on oil. With very low oil prices, they're going to have a huge cash crunch, along with a lot of other countries in Africa, a handful in Asia, a handful in Latin America. So there should be a bit more demand and a bit more appetite for these new outside-the-box solutions. I think actually, in terms of for the charter city space, it would have been great, but it would have been better if this happened like 2 or 3 years, because things would be more developed. There'd be more capacity to make these proposals. But right now, it's a little bit early for the charter city space. So there will be this probably 2 to 3 year window, because I don't think there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, but an L-shaped recovery, in which case it will be possible to sort of governments will be much more amenable to charter cities. And so I think a few projects will get off the ground in that, but perhaps not as many as if there was a little bit more, I guess, organizational capacity in the movement. The fourth question is demographics. Charter cities require a lot of people. And so in Europe, there's a sort of increasing fear of migration. And while 3-4 years ago, it was kind of let them in, now they're not letting them in anymore. So I think there's an interest in Europe for charter cities because of that. And then you also just have sort of general sort of, right, like where the demographics, where the migration patterns are. I proposed, for example, a charter city in Central America to help develop it to allow for maybe lessen the sort of stress of migration on American borders. So as these sort of trends develop and as they change, I think that's going to be another sort of key input to have to think about charter cities. So, okay, what are the last set of things to talk about is over the next 5 years. So what will we see? We'll see probably the first generation of charter cities will start to come online. So we're already seeing projects that are fundraising, that are getting some buy-in from government, that are moving dirt to varying degrees. And over the next 5 years, we'll basically see like, all right, like, are these successful? Like, do they hit 10,000 people, 20,000, 30,000? What is working? What is not working? And see these really, right, like start to take shape, start to take form, get a bit more traction on that. We'll probably even see that like second generation, a charter city that's launched in like 3 to 4 years is probably not going to be considered a first generation of charter city, but like a second generation. And they will learn from the best practices, and it'll be interesting to see, right, like will there be a one model that consolidates? Will there's going to be a little bit more experimentation for the first generation, but after there's an understanding of what models are working, what models aren't working. There's probably going to be a little bit of narrowing of the sort of types of projects that are embarked on. We'll see increased, I think, engagement from mainstream players. This has somewhat been fringe, particularly in the kind of techno-libertarian space. It's not really taken that seriously in DC or in other power centers. But I think that is starting to change. So there's definitely a lot more engagement that we've seen over the last like year or two, and that's definitely going to change over the coming years. I mean, in 5 years, right, it's possible to think about a Charter Cities conference where you get like the head of the World Bank to speak, or chief economist of the World Bank, and just that type of engagement. And I think this is very important because, right, if you're doing a tech startup, you can just build the startup and you're in an institutional environment where you don't need permission from Facebook, from Google, from whoever to build that. They can't really stop you. They can try to buy you out, but they can't actually stop you. But if you're doing charter cities, right, the countries can stop you. You need government permission to be able to build a charter city. And because of that, I think integrating them within the broad sort of, I don't know, consensus of international development of trade is quite important. Increased legitimacy for charter cities. So they'll go from sort of as this kind of crazy idea to like, okay, that's a thing. Like, what does it mean to talk about them, to engage them? What are these different approaches? And like I said, yeah, right, the first generation of cities will have a lot of different approaches, but over the next 5 years, we'll see the emergence of a set of best practices. Like, this is how you do specific things. This is the proven model, and a little bit maybe less sort of experiments, but a little bit more, right, like this is the thing that's working. And so with that, I would like to thank you. I'm Mark, Charter Cities Institute. Follow us on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. Feel free to email me and ask me any questions.
Mark, are there any final words or any housekeeping notes you want to leave for the attendees?
If any of you know any places we should build a new Hong Kong, email me.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. If you don't already follow 1517 Fund on Twitter, I encourage you to do that. That's where we announce many of these 1517 at homes. So thank you all. Have a good evening. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.